Greetings, friends. This is Chris Batts, your host of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In today's episode, I spoke with the leader of an AM Law 200 law firm. We discussed his passion for leadership, his love for lifelong learning, and how the firm's foundational value of humility, along with a couple other important factors, drove their recent incredible story of growth. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes. We interview corporate defense law firm leaders, partners, general counsel, and legal consultants. You're listening to episode 46 of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast.
Broadcasting from Kansas City, this is the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. In each episode, you'll receive actionable ideas and hear personal leadership stories of both men and women serving as leaders and executives in the legal industry. Enjoy a front row seat as Chris Batts speaks with general counsel, legal consultants, and law firm leaders and law partners at the top corporate defense law firms from around the United States.
Welcome to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Batts with the Lion Group. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Pat Whalen, Chairman and Managing Partner of Spencer Fane. Since 2013, Pat has been focused on the development and execution of the firm's strategy. For the past 5 years, Spencer Fane has been among the nation's fastest growing law firms. Prior, Pat was the chair of litigation and partner in the IP practice. Pat has received numerous accolades, including being named as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in the country by the business journals, and one of the best in the country in delivering outstanding client service to general counsel of the world's largest companies by BTI Consulting. Pat is active in charitable, civic, and industry efforts, including board participation. Pat received his JD from the University of Texas Austin School of Law and MBA from the University of Texas San Antonio. Welcome, Pat, to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Chris. Privileged to be with you and your listeners.
Pat, would you share the more recent Spencer Fane story and what was happening when you took the helm around 2013?
So Spencer Fane traces its roots back to the 1800s. We're, like most law firms that have been around for long, really are proud, and I use that term selectively, but certainly we prized our culture and our history. We felt really good about our integrity, and that was what kept many of us here. But we had to be intellectually honest about the risk we were facing, being part of an industry that was going through disruption and continues to go through accelerated disruption, being part of a community in the part of the country that was not thriving as much as other geographic areas, and then with our own personal commitment to our culture, I think made us very risk averse to opportunities. And what I saw occurring year after year is some of my colleagues were moving on to what they perceived to be greener pastures, and to really be intellectually humble, objective, and introspective about why that was occurring led us to develop a larger strategic plan 7 years ago. A significant component of that plan was growth, but I think one aspect of that is very important to distinguish is we certainly saw lots of organizations pursuing growth for the sake of growth. The notion that growth per se is healthy or per se optimal. We don't subscribe to that notion whatsoever. But we also had to be honest with ourselves that in resisting growth for the sake that growth itself presented risk could be just as risky. So having a more nuanced approach to deploy growth in service to our culture and to our clients was something we needed to be more open-minded about. And so we laid out a pretty detailed growth plan. We called it the 2020 growth plan. It had, lots of different aspects to it, quite a significant methodology around it. And we put that into place and rolled through those objectives in the 2020 growth plan a couple years early. So we achieved those metrics in 2018, and that has allowed us in the last year and a half to promulgate really a whole separate plan that really begins with the bedrock of revisiting, gaining clarity around our culture.
Pat, would you explain to my listeners the three-legged stool of Spencer Fane and how it applies to the firm's growth strategy?
Sure. Everything that we do is really based upon our value proposition for clients and similarly the value proposition for talent inside the firm. So our three-leg stool, as you refer to it, Chris, is number one, we want to be able to provide the very best service and value of any law firm in our markets. Number two, we want to be the law firm of choice for talent that shares our values. And then third, and really as a means to ensuring those first two objectives, we want to have a high level of operational excellence in how the firms run and how we drive value to our clients and to our talent within the organization. Really, everything has to channel through those three objectives.
Pat, in regards to operational excellence and partner time, one thing I noticed when speaking with you was the firm's intentionality of making sure partners were more devoted to their clients than actually managing the firm. Can you explain that and how that's been a benefit?
On the operations-facing part of this, we want to bring business-focused management to really all aspects of the firm. We believe in the notion of highest and best use. And so if somebody's particularly gifted in their strengths or in a client service area and a practice area, then they may not be quite as passionate or gifted about something in the back office or in shared services. It doesn't make a lot of sense to divert that professional into something that's not in her or his real strengths. And so that is a key piece of being operationally excellent. Now, there are a variety of KPIs that we use to measure our operational excellence and things like profit margin, cost per lawyer, overhead. Those are all, I think, indicators of how we are faring in that objective. But the notion is get the folks that have the training, the passion, and the strength on the business aspects of running a law firm as opposed to filling a position because you need somebody from the partnership to fill that particular job.
And from what I understand, this really drives profitability for the firm.
Yeah, I think using lots of different tactics, but having that commitment to operational excellence, I think allows us to have one of the higher profit margins in the profession. And we've seen that year after year. And one of the things that while we certainly don't ever want to become complacent, we think is a good data point for our approach is that unlike a lot of firms that have grown significantly over the last 5 to 10 years, as we have grown and have scaled up, each year that profit margin has been enhanced. So we think that we are appreciating economies of scale, which then allows us to drive that value to client engagements.
And that's kind of a big deal. What I think I heard you say, so as you're scaling, you're not suffering your profit margin, you're actually improving it.
Correct. It is sometimes been said that there's no economies of scale in the law firm business, and it's certainly challenging to do so. But with the types of business professionals that we have at the firm, with the stewardship that I think guides our approach, we've been able to kind of buck that trend and show real margin improvement while we've, grown in size almost threefold.
To grow like that, to execute in a way that you've just described, it sounds like you really need to have a strong set of values that align with and that you can grow with. Can you describe some of those points?
Yeah, I think at the core, there is a set of values that the firm lives by. And what we did throughout 2019, and little did we know at the time, Chris, just how vital it was going to be to do that groundwork on getting everybody in the firm around tables and beginning, and being very clear about the values that drive us to this firm, that have kept us at this firm, so that we can collectively and individually commit to those values and then ultimately be held accountable to those values. So the firm came together and all collectively identified really 4 key values. And whenever you articulate values, the challenge is not making them platitudes, because that's what they sound like. They can easily sound like buzzwords and platitudes. What we've been very clear on, you mentioned execution, is just like execution is the hard part of strategy, way harder than formulating strategy. It's much more difficult to personify and walk the values than to just promulgate and hang them on a bookshelf or on a wall. And so we were very mindful from day one that setting these values up and being clear about them was great, but the real importance would be being held accountable to those values. And so what those values we collectively decided, identified by everybody in the organization, and which we thought best summarized what it's always been at the firm, is a anchor theme of humility. And that may best be viewed really through the prism of intellectual humility. And that manifests itself in all kinds of ways. But one of the ways it manifests is seek to learn from others, engage in lifelong learning, seek to listen more than you talk, treating others as good or better than you want to treat yourself. And then most importantly, knowing that we have to humble our needs and our priorities to those of our clients. So we think that's really the anchor value in the organization. And then there are 4 values that really flow from that.
Pat, would you share those 4 additional values?
Sure. The first is, I think like most firms, we want to be highly collaborative. We want to be all about teams and less about individuals. And as we talk a lot about within the organization, that's not easy for attorneys to do, because when you look at the science on the lawyer personality, many of us kind of specifically opt into law school because it is more autonomy creating position. And then law schools actually end up exacerbating that proclivity. I mean, I compare my experience in business school, which is largely driven by group efforts, group projects. Grading really is based upon how does the group perform, versus the typical law firm model, which is entirely individualized. So being collaborative at a high level is another key value. The next one is empowerment. And again, these can sound like buzzwords, but we want to be entrepreneurial. One of the things that drew me to this firm almost 25 years ago was I saw at the time it was an incredible meritocracy. So being about self-determination, empowerment, inclusivity is a bedrock value as well. Another key value, the shorthand would be resilience. And again, we had no idea how important that was going to be going into 2020, but it's about being externally focused, about having positive energy, about having gratitude. Because again, when you study the typical law firm culture, the typical law characteristic of pessimism, that is not very conducive to being highly resilient. And then the final value was what we call just a fierce resolve to win. And that's all about continually heightening expectations. There's typically going to be in most organizations a gap between someone's true potential and then watered down expectations. So continuing to raise the bar on our expectations of each other and of ourselves is what we call a fierce resolve to win.
Pat, you have spoken to me about describing the firm as a high EQ law firm as an aspiration. Would you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of what I referred to is when you study the lawyer personality, we as a population tend to skew fairly high on IQ, but by an equal order of magnitude, we skew below average on emotional intelligence. We think that based upon all the research we've done in client acquisition and client retention, that many of the reasons why law firms score so low with their clients on service relates quite directly to that low EQ, the lower emotional intelligence that we have as lawyers. And so being really mindful about that gap and constantly talking about it, raising the self-awareness is something that we think has helped us bridge and will continue to help us bridge the gap in terms of the emotional awareness, the emotional intelligence that high-performing lawyers really need to have in order to bring world-class client service to our clients. And then equally important, to make it a world-class culture inside a firm, you've got to have, above average emotional intelligence.
Hi, listeners. This is Chris Batts, legal recruiter and owner of the Lion Group. My team and I place legal and compliance talent around the United States and are known for our level of communication, speed, and strong track record. If you're an employer hiring your first attorney or first general counsel or adding talent to your corporate legal department or compliance team, we should talk. Also, if you're a corporate defense law partner or group wondering about your options for a lateral move, we should also talk. Every aspect of our process is confidential, fast, and thorough. Contact us by going to our website, findthelions.com, or you can text the word headhunter to the number 44222, and then complete the web form and we'll follow up with you shortly. Now back to the show. Would you share historically what was headcount at Spencer Fane when you took the helm and give my audience some perspective on the growth of the firm?
Yeah, so we are a little bit more than 3x. I think we were just over 100 attorneys, and in a handful of markets, we're now well above 300 and up to 19 markets with, obviously revenue going up accordingly.
That's outrageous growth. Growing 200%, adding 200 attorneys, that's a lot of additions. And so if I understand correctly, you've grown by lateral acquisition. Is that correct?
Almost entirely. We've done a couple of combinations in a couple of our markets. So there have been a handful of firms that we've combined with that were smaller firms, anywhere from the size of, 9 to 25. But the bulk of it has been individual laterals.
Next question. What are some of the takeaways you've had from that tremendous growth?
Oh boy, lots of takeaways, and in continuing to assess and digest and evolve on those takeaways. I think that as we've grown, we've learned that there is an enormous appetite in the talent market for our vision, and I'm not suggesting that we have it all figured out and that we don't have to make even more significant improvement. But I think our vision along the lines of, the culture that we talked about, the dimensions in which we think we can and in some ways are world-class on the talent value proposition and on the client value proposition can resonate at a very high level. That has certainly been gratifying. I think that no matter what efforts you go through to try to integrate new talent at a high level, you're not doing nearly enough. So continuing to really build out systems and structures around integrating new talent is an even bigger challenge than I think I anticipated.
Pat, I understand that the firm has grown by the assistance of recruiters. What are some of the things you've appreciated recruiters have done, and maybe some things that recruiters can improve on?
Well, I don't know if I've got much criticism. It's probably not my place. What I've been impressed by, Chris, is individuals that take the time to make sure that there's a potential fit. I mean, no one can ever be certain, but, understanding the candidate, understanding the firm, and knowing that, there are going to be certain things no matter how good the firm is on certain dimensions, they're going to be weaker on other dimensions. I mean, that's really the essence of strategy, is deciding those things that you're going to be strong on and then saying no to everything else. So making sure that there's alignment between those dimensions in which a lateral is particularly focused on and the firm is critical, because no firm can be all things to all people. So taking the time, as I know you do, to deeply understanding the candidate you're working with, what are the things that are kind of high on her or his list of priorities, what are those things that really aren't as important, and then matching that up with the firm. And that takes a lot of time, takes a lot of conversation, and takes a lot of objective studying to say, well, you know, if you're really passionate as a candidate on these things, you know, I'm not seeing that with the firm. I know enough people in the firm, they're strong in these other dimensions, but they're kind of weak at, you know, so just making sure there's alignment on the priorities of talent and on what the track record is inside the firm is a critical piece, I think, for recruiters and candidates as well.
Pat, what advice would you give partners who are in the market and are starting to wonder if they should talk to another firm?
I think it goes back to what I mentioned. I think, you know, understanding truly what they're looking for, because if you write out your top 10 things that you really, the attributes as a lawyer that you want in a firm, firms may tell you that they're world-class or, you know, top tier on all 10, but like with any part of business strategy, if they're saying that, they're probably pretty mediocre on all 10. So knowing the key attributes and then making sure that there is proof point, data points, that it's not just advertising, that inside the firm, that on those, you know, 2 or 3 attributes that you think are most vital, knowing that there are always compromises and sacrifices, and some of the other things maybe on your top 10 list are not going to be tremendous, but on those non-negotiables, making sure that the firm can prove and that they live up and have a track record of living up to those attributes, I think is critical, because, you know, there's a reason why the studies and the surveys always demonstrate overall weak percentages of success with laterals. And I think it's just not having alignment on the priorities and the attributes.
Thank you, Pat. We're all in the thick of COVID right now. No one ever was truly prepared for a pandemic, but how are you, as a firm managing partner, chairman of the firm, prepared for the next downturn?
Our approach in thinking about this was really, in some ways, fortunate that we were structured in a way that we could be as prepared as anybody could be for this type of a downturn. I mean, we've been projecting for some time now that there would be a downturn coming. I mean, of course, nobody knew it would be anything like this, both in terms of the type and the depth. But building a firm, as we've talked about on this podcast, in good times is one thing, but be able to sustain it when a downturn comes is something. If you go back and look at 2008, a lot of firms that went into that in a growth mode did not fare very well. So for the last several years, we've been mindful that we were likely to encounter, at a minimum, a pretty good-sized recession. And so that's why we did not want to overextend ourselves, over-leverage ourselves. So I think coming into this with that strategy of sustainability certainly benefited us. I think having that, again, core focus on humility allowed us to make sure we did not engage in any wishful thinking, made us very disciplined about having data-driven solutions over intuitive or things that were emotionally appealing. So we developed a set of principles that were going to guide our approach. We promulgated these in early March, and we said, you know, these principles are our North Star during this. I mentioned one of those principles earlier, that we didn't want to just simply survive. We want to make sure that we continue to pursue our long-term strategy and that we emerge from this stronger, both culturally and strategically. So that's some basic principles that we developed as COVID hit to navigate through this uncertainty.
Has your firm gone back to the office yet?
We are doing a very mild tier 2 approach where everybody's encouraged to continue to be working from home. We were able to do it seamlessly. I mean, not that there aren't always some bumps, but if you would have told me 6 months ago that we'd all be working remotely, I would not have thought we would have been able to succeed the way we have. And so remaining very, very cautious and having pretty rigorous protocol for when folks do come in. But most of our markets, very few folks are coming in. And when you are in rigorous hygiene protocol, and typically folks are only coming in for a couple of hours and primarily working from home still.
Let's pivot to your story. Was it always your aspiration to be a lawyer?
I would say that crystallized probably when I was in college. I knew enough folks that were older than me who had gone to law school, enjoyed it, started out the practice, tended to enjoy it. I thought I had a lot in common with those individuals. So that's probably when it crystallized. It was really not a thought prior to then. I didn't have any lawyers in my family. I didn't really know any lawyers growing up. So it was really not until the later stages of college that I thought about law school.
Pat, I noticed the MBA degree as well. So it does sound like you have a real fascination, appreciation for business.
Yeah, I think those are dual passions. Obviously, enjoying the challenges of a legal practice in terms of the preparation, the advocacy is something I've always had a passion for those pieces of the practice. But then having an equal passion for business, I think it's fair to say are kind of dual passions that I've had since pretty early days of my youth.
Pat, I know you sought additional education at Harvard Business School when you took the leadership role at Spencer Fane. Would you share with us your thought process for why you did this?
Sure. Well, I think it comes down to ultimately a passion for lifelong learning. I think that to be a really effective leader that is able to sustain high-level performance in multiple roles and over a long period of time, one has to be a lifelong learner. To think that you're done learning when you're done with grad school or law school or after a few years in a role, I've not seen that work with very many effective leaders. So stepping into this role, I knew I had to embrace both the privilege and the requirement of being a lifelong learner. And so the Harvard Business School executive ed is world-class. And, being able to go there each of the past several summers and study with people all over the world. So you're studying with business executives from literally all over the world. I think the last one I went to, there were 75 countries represented with, phenomenal faculty leading the discussions. Helps you learn from other leaders, which is incredibly powerful, and again, gives you different frameworks to approach new problems. I have always thought, Chris, that the legal field, what I would call kind of the business of law, is really been, I think, badly under-theorized. I think when you study other industries, there's a set of frameworks and theories that can guide one's thinking that have been empirically tested and studied. And we've really kind of missed those frameworks and those theories in the legal industry. I think that because up until 2008, demand just kind of organically grew. There was largely a monopoly. We didn't really need in the industry to have as rigorous a business discipline as we now need to, and certainly will need to in the future. So going to a program like that where you're learning from world-class faculty and you're learning from business leaders from throughout the world, I think equips one with different frameworks, different perspectives, and really different lenses in order to approach traditional problems in unique or innovative ways.
Pat, how do you define leadership?
I think leadership's really just about serving others so that they can live up to their potential. I've always thought one of the most tragic things, and we see it playing out day in and day out in our society, but one of the most heartbreaking things is folks not living up to their talent or their potential. So I think it is the leader's solemn obligation, first and foremost, is to create a situation where folks are empowered, developed, in order to live up to their potential.
Pat, who has served as examples of leadership for you in your journey?
Well, it actually dovetails with your last question, Chris. The person who I've been inspired by, whose story I got to know when I was going up to those programs, is fortunately somebody that we just lost earlier this year, is Clayton Christensen. So Professor Christensen has been was a professor at Harvard Business School for decades. Prior to that, he was a business executive. He wrote one of the most influential business books ever written, but what was more compelling to me than his epic book on a business called Innovator's Dilemma was a separate book he wrote about how will you measure your life. And so getting to know him in that program, being a voracious reader of everything he has written and all the programs that he spoke at, and seeing both his excellence as a brilliant business mind, truly groundbreaking insights and research, but also seeing how he personified that as a teacher, as a parent, a spouse, a member of the community. It's somebody that it's hard not to be influenced by someone like that. So that's been obviously a powerful reference that I've kept in my mind. There's been countless others, both within Spencer Fane and in my family. But the thing that resonated with me when I first got to know Clayton 4 years ago was a true personification of world-class brilliance, but utter humility, which again goes back to the values that my colleagues have identified as core to this firm's culture. And also, I think the true North Star of any effective leadership is about authenticity and humility.
So, Pat, along the same line of leadership, you've communicated to me numerous times a passion for leadership. And I know none of us would know or would have known, maybe except Bill Gates, that we were going to be faced with in 2020, specifically COVID-19. And we've got a very real, very relevant crisis of diversity and inclusion in our country, to put it lightly. And so along the lines of a need for good leadership, would you speak to that as a reality for what's happening in our country around the world right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say wherever one sits in viewing the public health crisis, the economic crisis, the racial inequity crisis, and any number of other challenges, that leadership has never been more important. Without being too provocative or controversial, I think, again, wherever one sits on whether a political spectrum or wherever one sits as an observer, there is, unfortunately, I think, a truly epic need for great, thoughtful leadership, and at the same time, a dearth of leadership as we've gotten more polarized on virtually every issue as a country and really even as a world. There is, I think, been insufficient leadership where folks can come together, maybe with different philosophies or different views, but solving these, some of these are truly, once in a lifetime type challenges. And I just continue to see an asymmetry between the need that we have for leadership and the kind of leadership we're seeing really in all aspects of our society.
Pat, you may not have an answer for this, but where do you see hope right now, where there may be glimmers of potential solutions to the gap of leadership?
Where I see hope, Chris, is I think as a country and really as a world, we're going to have a different paradigm on leadership. I think the things that people have traditionally viewed as important to leadership are going to be devalued. And I think the types of things we've been talking about in terms of servant leadership, truly viewing yourself as the servant for the larger good and not about individual resume building or individual achievement, will take hold. And I think we will be rigorous in making sure that leaders of our organizations and in public leadership are in it for the right reasons. And I think it becomes incumbent upon individuals who would typically say, why would I want to expose myself or my family to that? We need to be more skeptical of those views, because I think that's in some ways the paradox we've gotten into, where the most effective people, the people who would be the most effective leaders, and I'm really talking about at any level within any organization, private or public, have, I think, recently been very cautious and negative about pursuing leadership. And that's created this void that I think we're suffering from right now. Again, really at almost every level.
Let's transition to more of a personal content. So I understand you have 4 kids, correct?
Yes. I've got a recent college graduate who's navigating COVID in his own way, a college student, and 2 in high school.
And is everybody home now? Are they all kind of out and about?
One of them's out and about. 3 of them are at home. So we are staying healthy and practicing a lot of gratitude, because, you know, the fact that we've stayed healthy and have been able to have this time together is a place that we can focus on the positive and fill our heads with gratitude instead of, you know, despair, which is easy to do in a time of crisis.
Are you guys going to get away this summer, or how are you going to spend some quality time together?
So we were planning on, at this time, actually, we were going to be traveling abroad. We've never traveled as a family abroad, but with my son's college graduation, my wife and I's 25th anniversary, we thought this would be a perfect time to go on a lengthy international trip. I was actually going to meet the other 5 in Europe this week. So obviously that got scrapped. So we are going to keep our powder dry. We don't have any travel plans in store, but we're going to keep our powder dry, and hopefully after, you know, we get to a vaccine and maybe a herd immunity develops and everybody's feeling safer about getting on airplanes, hopefully we'll be there in if not next summer, the summer thereafter. But we'll stay close to home this summer.
I know you're a passionate reader. Please share some recommended books for my listeners.
Yeah, I think on leadership, since that's a lot of what we've talked about today, and that's certainly where I spend most of my time reading. I mentioned the 2 books from Clayton Christensen, How Will You Measure Your Life, which is a great, I think, cautionary tale for lawyers and law firm leaders, because we generally are wired to be high achievers. And Professor Christensen does a magnificent job of cautioning folks that when you make that daily decision to always pursue achievement, you can look up with some significant regret 10, 20 years down the road. So I would recommend that to every professional. Nancy Kane has an incredibly timely book that she wrote out a couple years ago, another HBS professor, although she's a history professor. Her book is called Forged in Crisis. She profiles some epic leaders, from Lincoln to Frederick Douglass and others. Highly recommend that. I'm a big believer, a big fan of the book, The Mindset, that's written by Carol Dweck, who's a professor at Stanford. Bill George has a book called, he's a former Medtronic CEO and now a business professor. His book, True North, about authentic leadership, is fantastic. And then somebody who's taken on a lot of, I think, popularity in the last year or so, Brené Brown. She has a book that's just fabulous called Dare to Lead. So those would be ones that I can confidently say won't disappoint any professional or leader who's interested in, leadership in crisis, and just making sure you stay on track as a professional.
And Pat, how do you typically digest the content? Are you a Kindle reader or do you prefer paper?
Yeah, it's pretty geeky. So what I'll do is I will read on my Kindle, and for those listeners who do that, you have a highlighting function, and you can make your own notebook. So what I'll do is I'll create those notebooks for each book I read, and then I print those out, and then to be able to distill it at another level, I'll take the printed notebook, which is the highlights from the book, and then I'll put that in a separate notebook of other similar content. So it'll be distilled down many levels, because I think if you just read a book, the likelihood, a 300 or 400 page book that's filled with lots of great content, the notion that a reader is really going to digest that, truly apply it in just one reading is pretty remote. So that's why I go through that process, starting with the Kindle and then working through my own personal notebook.
Pat, last question, and it's two parts. First question, what is your superpower?
Oh, boy. Well, it's going to be the ultimate paradox, Chris, to brag. And that's something we've talked about internally. It's like, well, how can you promote one's humility? But I think being intentional about humility, and again, I know there's a lot of irony and a bit of a paradox there if I were to ever call it a superpower. Certainly not a superpower, but I guess what it allows is knowing that we all have dramatic limitations and blind spots. That's probably the superpower. Knowing everything you don't know and knowing that there's a lot that you don't know, I think is about as powerful as an attribute as one can have, because then you're committed to humility and lifelong learning and treating others with the same type of mercy and respect that you would want of a loved one.
And Pat's second question in tandem is, what is your kryptonite?
Oh, boy, my kryptonite. These are, I think the counterpart of humility is kryptonite. And by kryptonite, I would mean something that we're probably all vulnerable to is the exact opposite of humility, and that's hypocrisy. If you're espousing a value or you're demanding something of somebody that you yourself are coming nowhere close to personifying, nowhere close to actually exhibiting, to me, that's the kryptonite. That's kind of the very worst type of behavior or attribute. So I would go with superpower and kryptonite. I'd go with humility and then hypocrisy. And hopefully I display more humility than hypocrisy, but we're all likely to go down the road of hypocrisy way more than we should be.
Pat, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
I've really enjoyed it, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who listened to this episode of the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. If you haven't already, please take a moment and subscribe. Also, we would love your feedback. You can leave feedback in 3 easy ways. You can go to the blog post on our website. You can click Give Feedback link in the show notes on your device. And then thirdly, you can text the phrase LFL podcast to the number 44222. That's LFL PODCAST. And thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Law Firm Leadership Podcast. This podcast is for education purposes only. This content cannot be used for commercial use without written permission from the Lion Group. If you like this podcast, leave a review on iTunes.